The next form of writing that we're going to look at is one which is far more tricky to understand, and one which has caused a huge amount of controversy and argument, particularly in the Christian circles rather than in the Jewish circles. And that's the concept called apocalyptic. Now, the Old Testament doesn't have a lot of apocalyptic, at least not the way in which we have it within our Protestant Bibles. The main area or the main corpus of apocalyptic writing can be found in the second half of the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, chapter 7 onwards, is really more apocalyptic writing. So what is apocalyptic? Essentially, apocalyptic is talking about, or has become known as, the things of the end. In fact, the original word means to uncover or to reveal. And so often the concept is to uncover or reveal something which is hidden, something which almost in a sense God doesn't want us to know about, but begins to slowly reveal to us. And so it really has that element of being all about the end times, about the end of all things, the cataclysmic end. Now, we believe that most of the apocalyptic literature of the Tanakh, and most probably not only the Tanakh, but in fact there are other books, as you might recall, the Apocrypha books. Those are books that were written in the period between the end of the Tanakh and the beginning of the New Testament. They were written only in Greek. There's no Hebrew version for them. A lot of those were also apocalyptic in nature, so dealing with those concept of the end times or the end things. And so what we need to see is that they were written most probably because of the interaction that Judaism began to have with the countries or the empires around them, particularly the Babylonians and the Persians. It was the Babylonians and the Persians and the influence of their religions on Judaism that also begins to influence the writing of apocalyptic, or those concepts of the end times. Now, that doesn't change them, it doesn't make them any less valid. But what it does mean is that we need to be careful in the way in which we interpret them. Because, as you would know, that there's all these theories about what's going to happen at the end time. And we get these theories about how many empires and then how long and what date it's going to be. And as you would have realized by now, just about every single date, in fact, every single date that has ever been put forward for the end time actually has been wrong. And it's been wrong because of a misinterpretation of this concept of apocalyptic. We need to remind ourselves that Jewish people do not think in terms of linear time. That's a Greek thinking of linear time, that we go from this point all the way through all these points until we get to an end. Rather, what we need to understand is that the Jewish or Israelite understanding of time is cyclical, is circular. And as such, remember before from a previous model, the smallest circle, of course, was the circle of a day, that we start at sunrise and we finish at sunset. And so that's the smallest cycle of life. Then we have the biggest cycle of life, which is, of course, the seasons. And the seasons would go through from winter to spring to summer to autumn to winter to spring to summer to autumn. And so again, we have the cycle of the seasons. But of course, there is a bigger cycle as well. And that's the cycle of the beginning and the end. And so yes, there is a Jewish understanding that there is a beginning and an end. But that beginning and end isn't a complete end, because what we need to see is that even, for example, in the book of Revelation, there's a new heaven and a new earth. And so even once that cycle completes, it begins again. So it's a cyclical perspective. Now, if you're living in a cycle rather than living in a line, it means that apocalyptic means something different. Instead of just seeing that the end is an end in itself, rather the end becomes something of an indicator of what we have to do in the present. And so when you read apocalyptic, we need to stop trying to use apocalyptic as somehow a timetable for when the world will end. We need to stop using apocalyptic to say, how can we then foretell when the end is going to come? Because the concept of the end coming really doesn't make sense in Judaism at all. Rather, what we need to say is that apocalyptic, or the things of the end, have to impact on the way in which we live life in the present. And so it's using the end time things, it's using the time of the cataclysmic end of all things to actually inform about us in terms of our life now. The question is that when we're in this cycle, we've no idea where we are in it. We could be over here, almost at the end. Or we could be over here. We don't really know where we are. And as such, therefore, for the Jewish mind, they would say that you have to live every day as if we are approaching the end of all things. And so that's where the cataclysm comes in. He's saying, don't worry about when it's going to happen, but rather, because we know it's going to happen, how does that change the way we live in the present? So when you read the apocalyptic of Scripture, when we read apocalyptic in Daniel or in Zechariah and Zephaniah, when you read those pieces of apocalyptic, which seem to be talking about the end time, always remember that for the Jewish mind, they're not thinking about the end, but rather they're thinking about the present. How do I live in the present in the light of the knowledge that this big cycle of life from the beginning to end will one day come to an end? When that day is, no one knows. As Jesus himself said, the day that is appointed by God is known only to him, and he will set that date. In the same way, Jesus was trying to tell his disciples, watch out for worrying about what's going to happen, and instead live in the light of what's going to happen in this ever present.